You could hear the tension in the air before anyone even opened their mouth. It was one of those committee hearings where the stakes weren't measured in bills or budgets, but in pride, wit, and the ability to stay in control when the cameras were rolling. And that day, Senator John Kennedy wasn't just ready, he was coiled like a spring. Across from him sat a witness sharp-tongued, confident and clearly determined to make her point, no matter how many interruptions it took. From the moment her microphone went live, you could tell she had a plan. She wasn't here to answer questions politely. She was here to dominate the exchange. But here's the thing about Kennedy. He's not the kind of man you talk over without consequence. In fact, to those who know him, that's almost like waving a red flag in front of a bull. The hearing started like any other. Kennedy leaned in slightly, glasses low on his nose, that slow Louisiana drawl cutting through the formality of the room. He began with a question, not a trap, just a question, a reasonable, measured, calculated one. She answered. Or at least she started to. And then, before he could follow up, she cut in again. This time her tone was louder, sharper, pushing past the point of civility. It wasn't just confidence, it was a challenge. Kennedy didn't flinch. He asked his second question, and it was clear he was aiming for precision. But before the sentence was even complete, she interrupted again. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in total before he could even get halfway through the dialogue. Each interruption was like striking a match in a room already filled with gasoline, and that's when the dynamic shifted. Kennedy's eyes narrowed not in anger but in calculation. You could almost see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He wasn't going to argue for the sake of arguing. No, he was setting her up without her. Even realizing it, the third interruption came like the first, too loud, cutting, confident. But this time, the room noticed Kennedy's pause. It's the kind of pause that wasn't about losing your place, but about letting silence do the work for. You reporters in the back adjusted their pens. Cameras zoomed in. Even a few senators leaned forward in their chairs. It was in that moment, between the end of her sentence and the start of his, that the balance of power changed. She had been talking over him for the better part of the exchange, but she didn't. Understand what Kennedy understood. You only get so many interruptions before the audience stops hearing your argument and starts looking for the counterpunch. Kennedy didn't rush. He didn't flail. He waited just long enough for the tension to peak, just long enough for her to think she'd gotten the upper hand, and then, without raising his tone, without a hint of theatrical flourish, he delivered it for words that would cut straight through the noise, end the back and forth, and make the rest of the hearing feel like an afterthought. The reaction would be instant. Some would call it brutal. Others would call it perfect. But everyone's supporters, critics, and stunned onlookers would agree on one thing, in less than a sentence. John Kennedy had turned the entire exchange upside down. And for those who were watching live, it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. The silence was almost louder than the arguments that had filled the room just moments before. She was leaning forward, ready to fire off yet another rebuttal, but Kennedy had taken that pause. That deliberate, calculated pause, and the entire room leaned with him. Then it came. Those 4 words. Bless your heart, ma'am. It was classic Kennedy Southern, disarming, and yet carrying the unmistakable weight of a full stop. To anyone unfamiliar with that genteel phrase, it might have sounded polite, harmless. But to those who grew up in the South, it was the equivalent of dropping a verbal anvil wrapped in velvet. It didn't just end the conversation, it undercut her entire posture in front of millions watching. The moment the words left his mouth, the energy in the hearing flipped. She froze not because she didn't know what to say, but because she had something to say, and realized anything she said now would look petty. The cameras were locked in, waiting. Her eyes darted, and for a brief second, her confident expression faltered. Kennedy didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just kept his eyes on her, letting the 4 words hang there like an immovable wall. The sound of papers rustling in the background seemed deafening in that sudden quiet, for a man who could be as sharp as a scalpel when he wanted. Kennedy understood something most politicians never learn. You don't always win by talking more. Sometimes you win by saying just enough, letting your opponent's silence do the rest. She adjusted her microphone. A nervous laugh slipped out, not the kind of laugh you give when you're genuinely amused, but the one that escapes when you've been blindsided and need a second to recover. She tried to reframe, to jump back into her original argument, but now everything she said felt like it was bouncing off a wall. "Senator," she began. I don't think he leaned forward, still calm, still measured. "That's okay. I think enough for both of us." The chuckles that rippled across the room weren't loud, but they were enough. Enough to remind her and everyone watching that the momentum was gone. She wasn't in control anymore. From there, Kennedy pivoted, moving on to his next question, as though nothing unusual had happened. That was the genius of it. He didn't linger on the moment. He didn't try to replay it for effect. He let it breathe. Then he moved forward, forcing the hearing to follow his tempo, not hers. And that's when the real damage set in. Because in politics, perception is everything. It wasn't just that she'd been interrupted, it was that she'd been interrupted so softly that the audience saw it as both polite and devastating. The kind of exchange that ends up clipped, replayed, and memed for weeks by the time the hearing wrapped up. She was still answering questions, still making her case. But the spark was gone. She knew it. The senators knew it. The audience knew it. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a carefulness that hadn't been there before, because she understood now that every word she spoke might be met with another "for" that could undo it all. And as the camera shut off, Kennedy gathered his papers, stood, and gave the kind of half-smile that doesn't need explanation. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't traded insults. He'd simply reminded everyone that sometimes the quietest moments leave the loudest echoes. The hearing might have ended in that grand room, but the real battlefield was just waking up online. Within minutes, the clip of Kennedy saying "bless your heart, ma'am," was everywhere. On Twitter, ex-Natha, video spread like wildfire. One account posted it with the caption, "Kennedy just ended the hearing in 4 words. Within an hour, it had 500,000 views. People were clipping it from different angles, slowing it down, even adding dramatic background music for effect. Supporters of Kennedy were gleeful. "This is why we love him," one user wrote. Calm, collected, and deadly, with a single sentence. Others called it the most polite knockout punch in Senate history. A meme started pouring in Kennedy's face, superimposed onto a chess master, onto a cowboy in an old western, onto a samurai sheathing his sword after a single strike. But it wasn't just fans who were talking. Critics were quick to frame it differently. It's condescending and dismissive, one post read. "This is exactly what's wrong with Washington, more theater than policy." Yet even those critiques were helping the clip go viral, because the truth was, no one could stop watching it. Over on YouTube, political commentary channels pounced. Reaction videos were uploaded with titles like "Kennedy's Forward," "Takedown Explained," and "The Hidden Southern Insult You Missed." One commentator even broke down the phrase "bless your heart" in cultural context, explaining how it can mean sympathy in some cases and pure verbal dynamite in others. That video alone racked up 2 million views overnight. By the next morning, news networks had picked it up. Some framed it as a masterclass in political control. Others debated whether it was an unfair cheap shot. But here's the thing about viral moments. They stop belonging to the people in them. The internet takes them, shapes them, and runs with them until there's something bigger than the original event. For the witness, the woman who had interrupted Kennedy 3 times, it was a different story. While Kennedy's team quietly let the moment breathe, her staff scrambled to manage the narrative. They pushed statements to reporters, emphasizing her policy points, trying to steer the conversation back to substance. But that's the cruel reality of modern politics. The public rarely remembers the policy, they remember the punchline. Meanwhile, Kennedy was silent on social media. Not a single tweet, not a single interview. That was deliberate. He understood that adding commentary would just dilute the effect. The mystery of not explaining himself was part of the appeal. It let people argue about what he meant, rather than move on. Late that night, a popular late-night host played the clip for his audience. He paused it right after Kennedy's words, turned to the camera and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what a Southern mic drop looks like." The crowd erupted. By the time the week ended, Bless Your Heart was trending in ways no one expected. T-shirts, coffee mugs, GIFs, TikTok skits where people reenacted the moment in absurd, exaggerated settings. It had become more than politics, it was pop culture. And for Kennedy, that was the quiet victory. Because while others spent their energy reacting, defending, or spinning, he just kept moving forward. The hearing was done, but the ripples were still spreading. Somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of the storm. For 3 days, she stayed silent. No press conferences, no interviews. Just a carefully worded statement from her office about focusing on the work and not getting distracted by theatrics. But in politics, silence doesn't make the noise go away, just lets other people tell your story. And the longer she stayed quiet, the louder Kennedy's for words seemed to echo. Every time the clip replayed on TV, it wasn't just a reminder of what happened, it was a reinforcement of who was in control that day. Finally, on the 4th day, she stepped in front of the cameras. The press room was packed, journalists shoulder to shoulder, photographers fighting for a clear shot. She walked to the podium, papers in hand. Wearing a dark suit that made her look as serious as possible. "I want to address something that has been circulating in the media," she began. Her tone was steady, but you could tell this wasn't the speech she wanted to be giving. "Last week, during a Senate hearing, there was an exchange between myself and Senator John Kennedy. I have great respect for the Senate and its members, but I believe it's important to note that the work we do should not be reduced to sound bites and memes. It was a textbook attempt to rise above the moment, frame it as trivial, pivot back to policy, but here's the problem. When you address a viral moment head-on, you're not killing it. You're feeding it," she went on, saying the phrase "bless your heart" might be seen as folksy charm, but that it was, in her view, a dismissive tactic designed to avoid answering difficult questions. Reporters' pens scratched. Faster. The words "dismissive tactic" would be in headlines before the press conference was over. When she opened the floor for questions, it was clear the reporters weren't here to talk about policy proposals. The first question: "Do you believe Senator Kennedy owes you an apology?" She paused, just long enough for the cameras to catch the moment. "I believe the people owe it to themselves to demand more than forward dismissals of serious issues." Wasn't bad as far as damage control went, firm, direct, and reframing the narrative. But the internet doesn't care about nuance. By the time the press conference ended, clips of her speech were spliced side by side with Kennedy's original moment, creating a back and forth that played like a sports highlight reel. Political commentators had a field day, one called her. Remarks a calculated attempt to turn the tables. Another said it proved Kennedy had gotten under her skin, and in the court of public perception, showing that someone got to you is often seen as the ultimate loss. But she wasn't done. That evening, she appeared on a primetime news program. The host, sensing an opportunity for ratings, played the clip again before asking, "So, what did you think when you heard those words in real time?" She smiled, a practiced, measured smile. "I thought, here we go again, another man trying to silence a woman in the middle of making her point." That line landed with some viewers, especially her supporters. But for others, it shifted the conversation from the substance of the hearing to a debate about tone, gender, and decorum. The divide widened, and the clip's second life began, now framed not just as a political zinger, but as a cultural flashpoint. And while she was out front, defending her ground, Kennedy still hadn't said a word. By now, the headlines were everywhere. Her press conference, her primetime interview, her framing of the moment as an attempt to silence a woman. The conversation had moved beyond the hearing. It was now about personalities, principles, and perception. And through it all, Kennedy had said nothing. Not a word to the press, not a post on social media. He'd attended other meetings, spoken at unrelated events. But when reporters tried to bait him into addressing that moment, he'd smile, shake his head, and walk away. Until day 6, it happened. In a hallway outside a budget committee meeting, a small cluster of reporters was waiting, Microphones raised, cameras rolling. Kennedy emerged from the room, papers tucked under his arm. Someone shouted, "Senator, do you have a response to her comments?" I stopped, not abruptly, but in that slow, deliberate way that made everyone freeze. He looked at the reporter, adjusted his glasses, and gave a slight smile. "Well," said in that unmistakable drawl, "I don't believe in having the last word, but I do believe in having the right one." The group of reporters leaned in. "Are you suggesting she didn't have the right one?" someone asked. Kennedy shook his head. "I'm just saying sometimes folks hear what they want to hear. I wasn't trying to silence anyone. I was trying to get an answer. If 4 words are enough to derail your point, maybe your point wasn't all that sturdy to begin with. Was it no raised voice? No escalation? Just a short statement, delivered like he was reading from a Southern etiquette book? But it was pure Kennedy calm, surgical, and aimed right at the foundation of her counterattack. By that evening, the clip was everywhere. News outlets ran it side by side with her press conference. Commentators called it the counterpunch she didn't see coming. Social media buzzed with takes, supporters calling it a gentleman's dismantling, critics calling it passive-aggressive politics at its finest. And Kennedy, he went on with his day. Delivered a speech on rural infrastructure, met with constituents, no more comment. The brilliance was in the brevity, say, just enough to reignite the conversation. Then step away and let the other side keep talking. But here's the thing. When one side keeps talking and the other side keeps moving, the audience starts to notice the contrast. Her every appearance now seemed reactive, as if she were still fighting a battle he'd already walked away from. The late-night shows pounced again. One host joked, "Kennedy's playing chess while she's still rearranging checkers." Memes evolved now, featuring a picture of Kennedy walking away from an explosion. Sunglasses on, papers in hand, and in political back rooms, strategists knew exactly what was happening. The more she responded, the more oxygen she gave to his moment. The more oxygen she gave it, the more it became his story, not hers. For Kennedy, it wasn't just about winning the exchange. It was about controlling the narrative after the exchange. And on that front, he was winning without even showing up to the fight. By the end of the week, polls showed a bump in his approval rating. Not massive, but noticeable. Enough for pundits to say the hearing hadn't just been a viral clip-it. Had been a political boost. And somewhere, quietly, Kennedy was probably smiling. It was only a matter of time before they ended up in the same room again. The next Senate session was set for a high-profile committee hearing, one that was guaranteed to draw cameras. Journalists, in an audience that remembered exactly what had happened last time. The air felt heavier that morning. Even before the gavel struck, you could sense the undercurrent. Senators shuffled papers, aides whispered behind folders, and photographers jockeyed for a perfect line of sight. But the real anticipation wasn't about the policy discussion. It was about whether lightning would strike twice. Kennedy walked. In first, calm as ever. No theatrics. No grand entrance. It's just that slow, steady stride, as if he had all the time in the world. He took his seat, glanced briefly around the chamber, and began sorting through his notes. Then she walked in. Poised, deliberate, her eyes scanning the room like she was assessing the battlefield. This time, there was no attempt to avoid eye contact. In fact, she locked eyes with Kennedy for a fraction of a second as she passed his desk. Neither of them smiled. The hearing began. The chair outlined the agenda, and one by one, senators began their questioning. Kennedy stayed quiet at first, listening, jotting down occasional notes. She, on the other hand, made a point of speaking with authority when it was her turn. Her. Tone crisp, each answer projecting confidence. And then, their names were called back. Kennedy leaned forward, microphone on, voice measured. "Ma'am, last time we spoke, I asked you a question you didn't answer. I'd like to try. Again today." It was a calculated opening, polite enough not to trigger an objection, but pointed enough to remind everyone in the room why this moment mattered. She didn't flinch. "Senator, I believe I did answer." He raised one eyebrow just slightly, not in a way that anyone could understand. The room shifted. A few senators coughed into their hands to hide smirks. She pressed forward. refusing to let him control the exchange this time. "If you'll allow me to finish my answer," and here it was, the flashpoint. Everyone leaned in, because this was the exact place where the last encounter had spiraled into a viral moment. Kennedy didn't interrupt. Not once. He let her speak fully without a single break. But when she was done, he simply said, "Thank you. Now, for the benefit of the record, I'll repeat my question, and perhaps this time we can have a direct answer." That subtle emphasis direct answer wasn't lost on anyone. The cameras caught the tightness in her jaw. She knew he'd just put her in a position where any indirect response would play into his hands. She gave her answer. More concise this time, but the edge in her voice was unmistakable. And Kennedy simply nodded, scribbled something in his notes, and moved too. His next question, as though the exchange had been routine, it was a different kind of when not the viral punchline, but the demonstration of control. The message was clear. Kennedy didn't need to end her in 4 words again. He could control the tempo just by deciding when to speak and when to stay. Silent by the time the hearing adjourned, the press was already buzzing. Some said Kennedy was more dangerous when he's quiet. Others called it a chess player refusing to repeat the same opening move. Either way, the rematch had happened and Kennedy still walked away without a scratch. The second hearing was barely over before the internet lit up again. But this time the tone was different. The first viral moment had been about 4 words, a clean, sharp ending to a messy exchange. This one was about control, restraint, the kind of discipline that made Kennedy look less like a showman and more like a tactician. Clips of the new exchange flooded social media. Supporters praised the way Kennedy let her speak in full before, calmly pressing for a direct answer. "He didn't need a mic drop this time," one user tweeted. "Just boxed her in with manners." Others saw something more calculated. "This wasn't politeness," a political blogger wrote. "This was precision manipulation. Give someone all the rope they want, then tighten it with one question." The post went viral, sparking a new round of debates about whether Kennedy's style was clever statesmanship or quiet bulldozing. Cable news networks ran side-by-side comparisons of both hearings. In one, the sharp forward zinger. In the other, the slow squeeze of controlled questioning. Analysts argued over which was more effective. One commentator called it the long game, pointing out that Kennedy's patience in the second hearing made him seem like he was playing on a level she couldn't quite match. Meanwhile, her supporters rallied. Hashtags like #let her speak and #answers not games trended for hours. They argued that the senator's approach, though outwardly polite, was designed to undermine her credibility without engaging with her arguments directly. Memes popped up painting Kennedy as a puppeteer, strings attached to his opponent, pulling them just enough to make them stumble. But here's the twist. Even the criticism kept the focus on Kennedy. Every frame, every headline, every heated online thread kept him at the center of the conversation. He still hadn't addressed the moment directly. It's not a post, not an interview, just silence. And the lingering memory of him calmly holding the microphone while she fought for control of her answer. Political podcasts dissected it like it was a championship game. "He's not just thinking about winning the exchange," one host said. "He's thinking about how the clip will play on loop for the next 3 news cycles." That's Media Warfare 101 on TikTok. Younger viewers stitched together the 2 hearings into one sequence, a split screen showing Kennedy in the first, delivering his famous, "Bless your heart, ma'am," and in the second, listening in. Silence before leaning forward with, "For the benefit of the record." The caption read, "First the jab, then the chokehold." It got millions of likes, but in private, her team was worried. They'd prepared for another snappy insult, a repeat of the viral headline. Instead, they got something harder to fight: patience. Kennedy hadn't given them an obvious moment to attack, no rudeness, no outburst, just a quiet, unshakable demeanor that made every reaction from her side look just a little too defensive. By the weekend, pollsters noticed something subtle. Kennedy's favorability among undecided voters ticked upward, not dramatically, but enough to suggest his calm control was winning over people who didn't usually care for political fireworks. And for the second time, he'd walked away without. Chasing the spotlight, while somehow keeping it fixed squarely on him, behind closed doors, the mood in her camp was shifting from frustration to strategy. The second hearing had stung not because Kennedy had embarrassed her in the same flashy way as before, but because he hadn't given her anything to swing back at. No sharp insult, no outburst. Just that infuriating, calm precision. Her communications director laid it out bluntly in their Monday morning meeting. He's not fighting the way you expect him to. That's why he keeps winning. He's setting the tempo, and we're reacting to it. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. So we stop reacting, we set our tempo. The plan that formed was simple in theory, but risky in execution. Don't wait for Kennedy to ask the first question. Jump in early, take the initiative, and push him into a corner before he has time to set the pace. In political chess, that's called forcing the opening. But with Kennedy, it meant one wrong move could backfire spectacularly. Still, she knew another quiet defeat would be worse than trying and failing. Her staff began rehearsing lines, questions, and counterpoint scenarios in which she could flip the spotlight back onto him. They studied tapes of his past hearings, noting his habits, the way he paused before delivering a line, how he used politeness as a weapon, how he avoided raising his voice even when provoked. If you wait for him to make the first move, one aide warned, you're playing his game. And his game is built to make you lose slowly. Meanwhile, in Kennedy's office, the atmosphere was completely different. No strategy meetings, no frantic preparation. His staff had learned long ago that over-preparing for a political opponent often led to stiffness. Kennedy preferred to walk in with a clear mind and trust his instincts. When asked if he was concerned about another confrontation, he reportedly smiled and said, "Ma'am, I've been dodging gators in politics since I was knee-high. I'll be fine." The media, sensing the potential for round 3, began hyping the next committee hearing. Headlines teased the rematch of the rematch. Pundits speculated about whether she'd finally get the upper hand. In the days leading up to it, subtle signals hinted that she was coming in hot. Interviews where she dropped pointed critiques of performative politeness, tweets about the dangers of disguised condescension. Nothing named Kennedy directly, but everyone knew who she meant. Kennedy, true to form, didn't respond. He gave speeches about infrastructure and agricultural trade, shaking hands and smiling like he didn't have a political shadowboxing match looming. But those who knew him well recognized that stillness for what it was, quiet readiness. That wasn't the type to walk into a fight unarmed. If she was planning to ambush him, he'd be ready to make her swing at air dot and so. On the eve of their third public clash, both camps were convinced they'd crack the other's code. She believed Kennedy wouldn't know how to handle being put on defense. He believed she'd overplay her hand the moment she tried to seize control. The stage was set. The cameras would be rolling. And somewhere deep down, they both knew this one wouldn't end the way the last two had. The third hearing wasn't even 5 minutes old before she made her move. The chair had barely finished opening remarks when she leaned toward her microphone, her voice cutting across the room. "Senator Kennedy, before we begin, I'd like to clarify something from our previous exchanges." Heads turned. Reporters in the press section perked up. This wasn't how hearings usually started, and she knew it. Kennedy seated 2 chairs down, slowly adjusted his glasses. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "this is your time. Go right ahead." She launched in. It's no preamble, no hesitation. She spoke directly to the points he'd raised in past hearings, framing his questions as misleading and his manner as dismissive. It was bold, deliberate, a calculated attempt to put him on the back foot before he could dictate the flow. For the first 2 minutes, she controlled the room. Kennedy didn't interrupt. He didn't even take notes. He just sat there, listening with the kind of stillness that made people wonder if he was even engaged. Then, the precise moment she finished her last sentence, he leaned forward. It's not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate. "Well," he began. That familiar Louisiana drawl, stretching the word into 3 syllables. "I'm mighty grateful you brought that up, ma'am, because it gives me the chance to thank you for proving my point better than I ever could." The room froze. She blinked, caught between confusion and irritation. "Excuse me?" Kennedy didn't raise his voice. "See, in both our previous conversations, I was trying to ask a simple question. You chose to answer everything but the question. And now, here we are, third time's the charm, and you've just spent 2 minutes talking about me instead of the issue at hand?" A few murmurs rippled through the chamber. Kennedy let them settle before continuing. "I'm not upset about it. I'm just making an observation. If the goal is to discuss policy, maybe we ought to stop treating this hearing like a debate club." She opened her mouth to fire back, but Kennedy kept going, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the precision of a surgeon making a single decisive cut. "Now," he said, flipping through his notes, "since you've clarified your feelings about me, perhaps we can spend the rest of this time clarifying the facts about the bill we're here to discuss. That is, after all, why the American people are watching." And just like that, he shifted the spotlight away from her narrative and back onto the issue, framing himself as the serious statesman and her as the one fixated on personality over policy. It was a trap so subtle most people in the room didn't see it until it had already closed. By choosing to open the hearing with a personal jab, she'd given him the moral high ground. And Kennedy, never one to waste high ground, was now using it to steer the conversation exactly where he wanted. The rest of the exchange wasn't heated. It didn't need to be. Kennedy asked his questions. She answered them. But the earlier momentum she'd tried to build had evaporated. The cameras had captured the pivot. The headlines were already writing themselves by the end of the session. It was clear she'd tried to flip the script, but Kennedy had turned the page before she finished her first line. By the time the third hearings footage hit the airwaves, it was déjà vu for the political world, only this time the tone was different. The viral clip wasn't of Kennedy delivering a snappy one-liner or a polite knockout. It was of him sitting perfectly still, letting her talk, before calmly dismantling her opening move in less than a paragraph. The public reaction split instantly. Supporters saw it as another masterclass in control proof, that Kennedy could win a room without raising his voice or trading insults. "Plays the long game," one commentator said. This wasn't about winning one moment, it was about defining all of them. Critics, however, accused him of dodging the real debate. "This is what he does," one op-ed read: deflect, pivot, and paint his opponent as petty while avoiding having to defend his own positions. But even the critical pieces carried his name in the headline, keeping him at the center of the conversation. Her camp tried to salvage the narrative. She appeared on 2 morning shows, explaining that she had no regrets about confronting Kennedy directly. But the problem was simple. The footage didn't show her controlling the exchange. It showed her starting it and him finishing it dash again. Online, the memes evolved one last time. The original bless your heart moment was now paired with the caption, the jab. The second hearing's calm, surgical questioning was the squeeze, and the third, the checkmate. The trilogy was complete. And Kennedy's supporters treated it like the greatest hits of political sparring. Late-night TV ran a montage of all 3 encounters, ending with the third hearing's closing, shot Kennedy flipping his notes closed, as if to say, "We're done here." The studio audience roared, but the real impact wasn't in the jokes. It was in the numbers. By the end of the month, polls showed a clear bump in his favorability, particularly among independents who valued his composure. Political analysts noted that, in an era where loudness often drowned out substance, Kennedy's quiet dominance stood out like a sharp suit in a sea of wrinkled jackets. And those 4 words, "bless your heart," they became shorthand for a certain style of political takedown. Polite on the surface, lethal underneath. Even in unrelated hearings, when Kennedy delivered a pointed comment, social media would light up with variations of the phrase, "for her." The chapter was harder to close. Though she remained in the political spotlight, those 3 encounters became an unavoidable part of her public image. Every interview, every speech, every panel, there was always someone ready to bring up the Kennedy hearings. Kennedy, meanwhile, never gloated. He never wrote an op-ed bragging about the exchanges, never released a statement claiming victory, just kept doing the work at least. That's how he framed it. But those close to him said he understood exactly what had happened. He turned a single moment into a defining narrative, one that would follow both of them for years. In the end, it wasn't about the interruptions. It wasn't about the zinger. It was about control, the kind you keep when you speak less, listen more, and pick your moments like a marksman picks his shot. And so, in the halls of the Capitol and the corners of the internet alike, one story kept being told: the day she interrupted Kennedy 3 times. And he ended her in 4 words: